Wow. Lynn, and then in years.
All right,
How
guys.
are you, Matthew?
Hi, Lynn. See, look at all these faces we get today, isn't it? It's a bonus. All right, guys, let's start. If anybody else joins us, I'll gladly admit them to the call. All right, so welcome to the May 9th meeting of the PRC. So it's a pleasure to have everybody here. We have regrets from Irving and from Peter, although Peter's indicated that he will use the recording of the meeting to generate the minutes for the purposes of adoption next month. So that's great. So you're off the hook, Brendan. Okay, good stuff. All right, so I've circulated the agenda. So then I have somebody please to move the adoption of the agenda as circulated.
Move it.
Matthew, and a seconder. Andrea, thank you, Andrea, had her hand up. All right, thank you. And likewise, I recently sent you out the minutes generated by Peter. So can I have a motion to adopt the minutes from our last meeting? Howard and seconded Matthew. So Matthew's active already. All right, good stuff. All right, guys, super. So with respect to news and announcements, item 4 on the agenda. So the first item is still Peter with respect to Alberta policing issues, and he's not here, and he hasn't sent a draft yet. So we'll just hold on to that. I added a news item regarding Bill S-212, Kim Pate's bill, private members bill with respect to the spent conviction regime for criminal convictions. It seems to be getting some legs here. Brendan did a really nice job last month in telling us what's happening in committee. So I just thought it would be kind of nice, and this is from the Bar Association, to put this in our agenda just to see what's going on. But the fact that it's getting publicity and it's being reported on and what have you, is a good indication that it's not going to die, as so many private member bills do. Anybody have any comments on the article that I submitted? Okay, pretty straightforward. We're all pretty up to date on the content of where that's going. So that's nice news. I also included a report, a rather sad report on the conviction of Hassan Diab in Paris with respect to the allegation of terrorism. So that's an Al Jazeera piece that I put in there. Any comments on that from that? Oh, sorry.
I have a comment. Is it prerogative of the PRC and/or / the board to send a letter to the Minister of Justice on this issue of extradition, because the warrant has not been issued yet from France. I suspect it will. And I'm just wondering whether we take a position on it or we remain silent. I mean, this looks like one of those travesties of justice. So what can I say?
Well, we're open. I apologize for that, guys. I can't turn that off. Maybe I can. Sorry. There we go. Yes, I can. Any comments on Matthew's?
I might just say I'm supportive of the sentiment, and I agree wholeheartedly that I think it could lead to a travesty of justice. I'm certainly not an expert in extradition law, so I don't know how much I could bring to it, especially also when looking at the system of justice. I can't remember the inquisitorial system. I can't think of the name in English, but anyway, I'm obviously not an expert in that either, so it's hard to say exactly what I could add to that, but I at least support the sentiment wholeheartedly.
Well, I do have experience once upon a time in extradition law. There's an old adage for lawyers that deal in this field, and that is, what's your preference, aisle or window? That pretty much gives you the range of discretion that is usually exercised by the Minister of Justice, who has the last word on this particular point. So, Matthew, are you suggesting that we write to the minister? Is it the minister you want to write to?
I think that my view is I've always historically been an activist, as some of you know, many of you know. And I think the PRC has a role to play. And I would ask that maybe Howard and Miles could draft a letter for the board's review, because we're going to need the board to sign off if we decide to issue a letter to the Minister of Justice. And quite frankly, this is going to come down to the minister. Where it's going to go.
Oh, yeah, it's the minister's decision. The problem is that as a function of the treaty we have with France dealing with extradition and the act was amended a little while ago. There's just such little discretion, by the minister in this particular case, based on the treaty that both countries have. I don't know. I mean, I would be heartbroken if Diab was extradited. Right? It's a terrible, terrible outcome for a man who is, by all accounts, innocent of what he's been now convicted of again. But again, I'm open. I mean, if the PRC wants a letter to the minister, then a letter will be done. If you guys want to do that.
Well, I make a motion that a letter be drafted to the Minister of Justice with respect to our very profound reservations extraditing him back to France. And I would ask that obviously this letter has to have the approval of the board because it's significant and it is a policy issue. You'll remember, Miles, that he was previously extradited by a previous attorney general and spent over 2 years in confinement and then was released by a French judge. So it's a very strange case.
Howard?
I just wonder if I can jump in before you consider the motion, and let me start by saying I applaud and have always appreciated Matthew's activism over the years. He has a keen eye for knowing when we should be putting our views and voice out. A couple of things just to add to the mix. The Justice and Human Rights Committee is currently considering a report on extradition law. And I have to believe the Diab case is a big part of the subtext of all of this. The report they haven't finished their consideration, so we haven't seen a report yet. That might be something we could use as a lever. We could wait to see it and then comment on it. Secondly, I was surprised to see the conviction in France. They keep talking about in absentia, but Diab was represented by counsel there. It's not that he didn't put in an appearance, as lawyers would say. His appearance was not in person, but he was certainly represented there. Bit of an echo. Anyway, so I was surprised he was convicted, but of course, given many of the inflammatory statements made by the French prosecutor, it's not hard to understand that there's a real sentiment and anger and upset there. They want someone to blame for this decades-old horrific terrorist activity, and they seem to think they have one person. Whether Diab did it or not, the process has been a terrible travesty of justice in Canada. And I've spoken actually fairly recently to a lawyer who works in justice on this, and they, of course, defend the process. With the conviction, I think Matthew's right. They will request extradition. I think if the process goes to court, the court will not be able to stop it. Miles, I have a little sense of a different view with you with respect to the discretion. The Minister of Justice has discretion in more than one place throughout the process. Whether or not he will exercise it in favor of shutting down the extradition is a good question. My sense is that he won't do that. Although, given the fact that the Prime Minister said and has been repeatedly quoted as having said that what has occurred with the lax extradition of Diab was a travesty, maybe they'll think better of it. The final point I'd just like to add to all of this is I think the process is a complete travesty. It's worth noting that France refused to extradite to Canada a priest who was accused of sexual assault of children in Nunavut, 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less. France will not extradite what they call their nationals. So if you're a citizen of France, they won't extradite you to Canada. Why are we extraditing one of our citizens, Diab, to France, and not once but not twice? So the process seems to be a travesty. I do not like the standard or anything about the Extradition Act. But the one final thought I would have is that there's a lot of things that the PRC could be commenting on right now. For instance, bail and the allegations of increased crime levels as a result of people released on bail. There's a lot of stuff in the news. And so I'm wondering, part of the question is how thin we want to spread ourselves. Now, a quick letter just saying we find the process in the Diab case lamentable, and if in fact France requests extradition, we would hope Minister Lametti would decline it. It wouldn't take a lot, Miles, if you wanted to do a draft. But remember, there's a lot of things going on, and I think we haven't yet jumped in on bail. And I know there will be a bill coming forward. I surmise, I don't have inside information, but I would bet a lot of money we will see late May, early in June, a bill from the federal government on bail reform. I don't think it's going to look particularly good from my perspective. Anyway, the question is keeping your powder dry, how much, but a simple letter. Matthew, thank you for the suggestion, and I agree with your sentiments on that.
Motion on the table, asking unanimous consent.
I think Lynn had something there.
Yeah, I also agree with you, Matthew. I just wanted to bring to recollection that in prior cases we've drafted a very simple, straightforward letter in support of an issue, and named other organizations, other associations with whom we have an affiliation, and that seemed to really strengthen our position as well, and build community for the CCGA. I'm thinking, of course, John Howard Society is often a partner in these areas, but there are so many. There seems to be a quick internet search that shows that there's so many groups who are adopting the same position as us. So I think maybe a good strategy would be to keep the letter simple and emphasize those points that we share that other groups have already made, and look at this as a very simple opportunity for us to add our voice.
The CCLA in particular have been very, very upfront on this, but you're right, Lynn. Yeah.
Sure. Do we want to wait for the Justice and Social Committee to prepare a report?
Miles, if you want to draft
I never
something,
wait for a parliamentary committee.
Well, the only issue I have, and so the timing is tough. I'm leaving in 2 days for I'll be to the country for another 10 after I leave, so I'm just not going to get to it before I leave. So if we're okay to wait till I get back, more than happy to do a letter.
I think that would be the general consensus.
Sure. So I'll draft a letter and circulate it, and then we'll take it from there. And that'll be the earliest will be a week after next Monday, Monday. So that I'll get to it that week. So anything else in this issue? Any other issues? Anything in the news? I mean, there's always 6 issues that Howard publishes weekly in the CCGA update, but our newsletter. Anything else we want to have a discussion on before we move into?
I just wanted to bring up a little bit of a contemporary news, and I have no position on it, but there's this interesting thing happening in British Columbia with respect to the city of Surrey. Apparently, the province wants the city to establish its own police agency, and they've been setting this up, and there's been quite a lot of money allocated to do this. But the mayor of Surrey, recently elected, apparently ran on a platform to return to the RCMP contract. And there's this hullabaloo going on that apparently there are well over 500 vacancies in the RCMP roles with respect to their provincial policing contracts. And I was surprised that there were that many vacancies. Wow.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Matthew. Any other news items, Brendan?
I just noted it just came out in the new. It was a CBC article from this morning. And it was a letter written by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, discussing how the issues of judicial vacancies on federally regulated courts. How there's, I forget quite the number. It seemed like quite a substantial number of vacancies. And in the letter, I believe he addressed it to the Prime Minister, but he said that that this could impact criminal trials, and of course with the Jordan ceilings. The concerns are not particularly new. I think we're all pretty aware of those concerns, but I think the interesting part was that the letter was actually was written, and it seems to be gaining more traction to fill these vacancies.
Good, thank you, Brendan.
Miles, just one other quick thing in the newsletter. There's a reference to a regulatory initiative by the government of Canada about dry cells, CSC. So there's indication of a consultation and regulations that may be up and coming soon about capping the amount of time someone can spend in a dry cell. It also, I think, is talking about body scanning. This is, I think CSC has already moved in policy to prevent dry celling for female prisoners who are suspected of secreting contraband in their vagina, which was horrific and horrendous. But the dry cells are the worst of solitary confinement. There's no running water. It's degrading and dehumanizing. I understand at times CSC needs to do what it can do to stem the flow of drugs moving in and other contraband weapons moving into federal institutions, particularly with opioids and fentanyl, which, as we know, can be lethal. But it's this dry celling has been very controversial, and so I'm happy to see that CSC is moving on a consultation for regulations. I wish Irving were, Irving were here to comment, given his connection with CSC. I will not call on Rob, who's with CSC. I think it's probably too close to home. But anyway, watch the consultation on these regulations. Dry cells are even the heavy end of solitary confinement. So something interesting to follow.
Thank you. Thanks, Howard. Any other news, guys? All right, thank you. Let's move to business arising. So we'll move into the parliamentary committees. The first one back to Howard is Justice and Human Rights for the Commons.
Okay, there's thanks, Miles. There have been 7 meetings, kind of surprising when you count the weeks, just since our last PRC on April the 11th. 4 of those meetings were on Bill C-41, which I had mentioned to you last time as a bill that's moving quite quickly. The C-41 is the bill that would create a mechanism whereby the Minister of Public Safety may authorize or provide a license to NGOs to work in terrorist controlled areas. So part of the thinking for this is to focus on Afghanistan. And so it was discovered that because the Taliban control the government there completely, any NGOs working there, not that they have an easy time of it, especially if they're women, but any NGOs working there, anything they do benefits the government in a sense. So there's a criminal code provision that criminalizes that. It's section 83.03, paragraph B. It's an interesting process, and there's been some procedural wrangling, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But C-41 is certainly moving very quickly, but now has hit a snag, and is kind of the committee is considering and has adjourned their deliberations. But this bill has a lot of support from different departments of the government, Foreign Affairs, Justice Canada, but also Citizenship and Immigration. And it was a perceived problem with our terrorist control under the criminal code that in fact was making it more difficult and perhaps criminalizing NGO activity in a theater like Afghanistan. I can come back to that in a minute, but 4 of their meetings were spent on that. The 2 meetings on, as I'd mentioned before, so May 1st and May 3rd, we're dealing with their continued examination of extradition law reform. The committee started consideration of a draft report on May 1st, returned to it on May 3rd. They seem to have set it aside for a little bit, so I'm not quite sure when it will come out, but we will see it at some point. The most recent meeting yesterday of the Justice Committee dealt with a new bill for them, C-295, which is an act to amend the criminal code, round bracket, neglect of vulnerable adults. I'm sorry, adults is what I'm trying to say. This is a private member's bill sponsored by Hetty Fry, who was a former longtime cabinet minister. She's no longer in cabinet, but a health minister, an associate health minister, a minister of Indigenous Crown Relations. Again, like Matthew, she's an activist and a very decent and thoughtful person. This bill, of course, is I think flows right out of the COVID situation where she's attempting to create an offense for managers and owners of long-term care facilities where they fail to provide the necessaries of life to residents. Actually, there's a provision that could cover this already under the criminal code, but this bill would allow the court to make an order prohibiting the owners and managers from ever working again in this capacity, and also proposes an aggravating sentencing circumstance. It was just had first reading on May the 8th, and then the committee is going to take it up as a priority matter. And Hetty Fry appeared as a witness yesterday. The evidence is not yet available for that, so I cannot comment further at this point. But keep an eye. It's an interesting response, I think, largely due to the surprising, horrific, astounding number of deaths in long-term care facilities as a result of COVID. But it's not just that. The facts are coming to light of how horrible some of these places are in terms of the way they treat helpless people. And of course, with COVID, their relatives couldn't even get in to see if they were fed or bathed or anyway. Keep an eye on this. The other so C-41, yes, extradition law. So the committee at their last meeting yesterday, they've talked about prioritizing C-41, C-295, and C-224. C-224 is a curious little private member's bill, actually proposed by a conservative minister, and it would clarify something that seems to be amiss in the regime of trafficking in persons. Just bear with me for a second. I'm just trying to. Yeah, 224 we haven't looked at or talked about, but 224 is the summary says this enactment amends the criminal code to specify what constitutes exploitation for the purposes of establishing whether a person has committed the offense of trafficking in persons. Again, proposed by a member of the Conservative caucus in the Senate, and it has actually passed the Senate. So I have to believe it's a friendly amendment that the government is supporting. We'll see when it gets into the House, but it seems to be correcting an oversight or some type of flaw in the process, the regulatory regime under the code for trafficking in persons. Now, I don't know if you want me to go more into the procedural thing on C-41. It's just an interesting little thing. I also want to mention two reports, so let me do that quickly. Of course, the third report is we're waiting for the extradition law reform, as we've said, but also the committee's report number 10 on the defense of extreme intoxication akin to automatism following the SCC decision in Brown. You'll recall that the government introduced this and it moved so quickly that the committee didn't even have a chance to look at it. They looked at it very quickly, did a little bit of a report, but this bill passed extremely quickly. They requested a government response. That was tabled on April the 17th. I haven't heard much of it in the media. Basically, it says, but on the part of the government, that they know this is a complicated, difficult issue. They think their amendment is charter proof. Their amendment focuses on criminalizing someone who, with criminal negligence, consumed intoxicants to the point where there was a risk that they would become so intoxicated that they would become automatistic. The government talked about, they thought their amendment was good, of course, and talked about monitoring the situation. Other than that, it doesn't say a lot. The other report that's of interest and worth noting is, you recall the report number 7 by the Committee on Improving Support for Victims of Crime. The government tabled also on April the 17th its response to the committee's report. Now, I have to admit to being a little bit skeptical and jaded. The government's response is a 9-page letter written by Lametti, almost all of which is saying what wonderful things they've done in funding and legislation. They even cite the wrongful conviction proposed legislation as part of their response, pointing out that there's going to be a position for victims liaison in the wrongful convictions commissions. But they lather it on very heavily in 9 pages of wonderful things they're doing. They also say more than once that the primary responsibility for victim programming and legislation is provincial territorial. I find the letter less than helpful. What I'm going to do as soon as I stop talking, hopefully soon, I'm going to put the links to both of those government responses into the chat so you can copy and pull them out of there. I don't think there's anything great or wonderful in both of them, but you may want to take a quick look at them. So Miles, I'm at your disposal. Do you want me to talk a little bit more about this procedural thing on C41?
Sure, go, yeah.
Okay. I have a tendency to talk too much, as Matthew will tell you, but I don't want to take too much time. But C41 it's just such an interesting little thing to allow, a seemingly little thing, to allow the government to exempt from criminalization NGOs that will be working in Afghanistan or other theaters where terrorist regimes are actually controlling things, so that any aid provided to the people of Afghanistan, in a sense, benefits the government, the terrorist government. This has been moving very, very quickly. 4 days of committee hearings, 17th, 19th, 24, and 26. A conservative member of the committee proposed a motion to amend that bill to broaden it a little bit. And this is what that conservative said. It said, it's become clear during the clause-by-clause consideration of this bill that there are significant problems with it, problems that can most effectively be resolved if we were able to slightly expand the scope of the bill. As such, I would suggest that this committee move forward as quickly as possible with asking the House to give us the powers that we need to make the changes to the bill that are required to respond to what we heard from international development organizations about what will allow them to do their work. And so the motion to amend, just talking procedurally, at second reading, a bill is approved in principle, as you all know. This amendment proposed by the Conservatives would expand the scope of the bill, and so they have to get the approval of the House to consider that and perhaps make that change. Otherwise, the committee would be outside of its terms of reference of examining the bill within the scope of what the bill was as approved at second reading. So the motion was to go back to the House to ask for this permission. Immediately thereafter, an NDP member tabled a motion to adjourn. And that motion to adjourn was carried 6-5. So the NDP's rationale essentially was that we need more time to think about this amongst ourselves, to see, I guess, to consider whether the bill should be expanded in response to some NGO concerns, whether they should go to the House and ask for that permission, whether they should just move on. So it's a contentious little procedural wrangle that has actually stalled the very quick pace of this C41 bill that you would think everyone would support. I would have expected unanimous consent, to use Matthew's expression on this bill, but anyway, they've stalled a little bit. Although my guess is there's a lot of negotiations going on behind the scene. But I've never seen anything quite like this. They adjourned the debate on the bill in committee before they got to the motion to ask the House for the power to amend the bill beyond the terms of reference that they received at second reading. So anyway, just an interesting little thing. Keep an eye on it. the licensing scheme going to public safety would be very interesting. It could create a whole little regime within public safety for deciding which NGOs can work in which theaters that are controlled by terrorist organizations. But interesting stuff. So let me stop there, Miles.
Well, thank you very much, Howard. Any comments or questions for Howard on his report? Okay, thank you. All right, guys, let's move on to public safety and national security and Rob in person.
All right, just getting the mute button off there. Okay, thanks, Miles. So CQ met 5 times since our previous PRC meeting, including one held or perhaps being held today right now. One meeting, the first of those 5 meetings concerned the annual report of 2021 of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. And the other 4 meetings focused on Bill C-21, the firearms bill. So on April 18th, the meeting where they considered the annual report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, 4 reps of that committee attended CQ meeting. The main focus of that was the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians cyber defense review. One of the key I won't go into everything that was discussed there, but one of the key recommendations of that review was strengthening the government's cybersecurity perimeter, mainly by having and applying a consistent cyber defense policy that would apply to all federal organizations. As it stands now, that is not what is currently in place. So there are some weak links out there among the government departments with respect to having an adequate, I guess what could be deemed an adequate cyber security perimeter. So sort of treating the entire government as like a one enterprise with a strong perimeter. On April 25th, the committee CQ resumed its study of the withdrawn amendments to BC 21. On that day, the Minister of Public Safety appeared along with representatives from CBSA, DOJ, DPS, and Emergency Preparedness, and the RCMP. So the concerns expressed by some of the committee members were similar to previous, what was covered in previous meetings, such as, the questionable impact of increasing the maximum sentence for firearms trafficking from 10 to 14 years. Some women's groups not being supportive of the bill's red flag provisions. Clarity of the impact of the bill's various firearms related definitions. Those are still causing some angst. Through the work on this bill, there is intent to change the process of classifying firearms, basically by using technical definitions that would include the physical characteristics of the firearms, and that being done in partnership with the industry. And another issue that seems to come out every time is the issue of ghost guns made by 3D printers, and that continue to be a major source of concern by police organizations in both Canada and the United States. So moving on to May 2nd, the committee resumed its clause-by-clause study of Bill C-21, and in doing so, they ended up coming up with some amended definitions of prohibition order, prohibited firearms, firearm part, and semi-automatic. There were some others covered, but those are the kind of ones of interest after hearing all the talk over the months about the definitions issue. And there was a bit of committee business there. They decided to hold 5 meetings dedicated to Bill C-20, which is an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission. There were 2 more meetings about C-21, on May, one on May 4th and the one today, and those are being held with the assistance of government lawyers and government firearms experts, although there's no evidence available as of today. The only other thing I like, and that concludes my my summary, but there's one other small thing I'll mention, kind of out of interest to myself, and also because Howard touched on this, learned something new every day, I guess. So at one of those meetings, I think it was the May 2nd one, it might have been the one before that, late April. There was some talk at the committee among the members of moving or trying to bring the bill, sort of put it before the House again to perhaps propose to the speaker, I guess, that the scope has perhaps changed since the original when this was originally put forward, mainly meaning that it started out as, at least in my understanding, mainly meaning that it sort of started out focused on handguns, and now we're into pretty big focus and a lot of talk about the long guns and hunting rifles and this type of thing. So I think I couldn't figure out exactly how that ended. It seemed to be chatter, talk about how it could be done, and some members liking it, some members not, and then it seemed to somewhat dissipate. And I don't know if that it will be resurrected in a future meeting or not, but that came up. Just thought it was interesting, the whole concept of kind of being something being within or without the scope, and then you pitch it back to the House to see, I don't know if there's some interest to change or just decide that some parts of it, I guess, are off limits, or perhaps then change the scope to include whatever parts need to be, included, or that folks want to include. So anyhow, just a little extra piece of information there, I guess. So that's the end of it for me. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pitch them my way.
Matthew?
Rob, most recently there was a controversy generated by the administration's amendment. They are prohibiting all new automatic assault rifles, new, as of the date the legislation will pass, which hasn't happened yet. But they are not prohibiting existing stockpiles of these automatic assault rifles, weapons. Although there's some confusion, and maybe you can help me, because I'm not a gun expert. But they've deferred this issue to discussions of future regulations. I don't understand.
Yeah, I read that, Matthew, and I didn't understand exactly the direction that's going to take. But yeah, you're right. That's what happened. So it was odd. It said what I read was that, just like you said, there's some of the firearms will be prohibited as of now. There's ones that are out there that this bill will not touch. There was concern about that by some of the members. It struck me as odd actually, just as an average person, that would be the way they're going, but it seemed to be the way they're going. At least it didn't seem to have a resolution to that at the committee, and I don't believe they made any amendment toward that. And I believe you're right in that there was, and I can go back and reread that section, but I believe there was some reference to depending on regulation or something in the future to maybe deal with that. Or perhaps I'm wrong about that, and there was no intent to go there at all. I can't quite remember, but I remember reading about it. But I can't answer your question with absolute precision here.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments for Rob? Okay, Brendan, Legal and Constitutional Affairs in the Senate.
Yes, I'm just gonna put something in the chat really quick, and it'll be clear what it is in just a moment. But the committee has met only 4 times since our last meeting. They're slowing down for a few months. They're going pretty quick. Their meetings have mostly been on Bill C9, which is an act to amend the Judges Act. They also that was in all 4 meetings actually. Then in the most recent 2 meetings, so on May 3rd and May 4th, the committee also spoke about Bill C47, which is the budget bill. Again, I know we've dealt with this before, where the government has put in certain provisions in a budget bill that really shouldn't be, because it's not quite budgetary. there was in the budget bill, at least I'll just address that really quick because it was I don't have a whole lot to say on it. But for the budget bill, there were changes that were discussed in the committee about changes to the Canada Elections Act and privacy rights of private information that political parties hold. I didn't look too much into that. It was getting to privacy law and things like that. They're a little beyond me, and I didn't think it was of a great degree of interest to the PRC. If I'm wrong, and if people would like a more in detail report on that, I can go back and look at it. No problem at all. I just didn't look into that part of it too much. The second part, if you all recall, in that budget bill, there was discussion of changing the criminal interest rate. There's only been one meeting that really spoke about the interest rates. It was a little more of a technical meeting. Nobody seems to be really against the changes to the criminal rates. There is some questions arising around harmonization because harmonization across the country, because certain provinces have different rates, and so there's just some preliminary discussion on that right now. Like I said, it hasn't gotten too far though. There's another 2 meetings scheduled in the next couple of days, and I think they'll get more into it at that point. The larger item that the committee has spent a lot of time on was Bill C9 again, which is the Act to amend the Judges Act. As I discussed at the last meeting, essentially it is changing how complaints are dealt with, and specifically complaints against federally appointed judges. And not to repeat too much about what I said the last time, but there is some concern. Basically, the idea with this new complaints process is to increase transparency, increase efficiency, and by cutting out certain steps, by streamlining certain decision making. And there was quite a degree of consultation on these changes, from what I understand. Most parties seem to have certain little things that they would like to change, or certain things that they certain things that they would like to change, but on the whole, most witnesses have agreed that the bill represents a happy medium, and they would rather see the system change now with what we have than to start at square one and start consultations over again. The main concerns are around a few topics. The main concerns being that because in certain at certain levels of the complaints process, lay people are involved, and in other stages they are not. So I think it's in certain appeal decisions, if a request is, or if a complaint is dismissed, and if somebody appeals that, I believe that lay people are not involved in that stage. So some witnesses have said lay people should be involved at every step, regardless if it's an appeal or not. We shouldn't be deciding which ones that they are a part of or not. There's also some concerns around who polices the police in this case. So if they think that the Canadian Judicial Council has made a mistake or some sort of error, is there any recourse? In the current iteration of the bill, there's not. So they could, so for example, there is recourse to the Supreme Court of Canada. However, most people say since the Supreme Court takes so few cases that in essence, there really is not recourse should people have an issue with the work of the new body investigating these complaints. So many witnesses have tied this back to transparency and fairness and the appearance of those subjects as well. There's also one bit of the bill that has caused a fair bit of that has been discussed quite a bit, is the idea of including diversity on some of these panels within lay people and within other evaluators or other people who are involved in the complaints process. But there's a little line, there's a little caveat that says something along the lines of that diversity should be promoted as much as feasible. And some people think that that waters down the diversity requirement, and it just becomes sort of a box to check and nothing more. So that's sort of where they are right now. I believe that they are heading to clause by clause shortly in the next few meetings as well. But as it stands, I believe not a whole lot of changes will be placed on this bill. We'll see, but I'm getting the impression that most people are content with a less than perfect bill to modernize the complaints process. Oh, so one other complaint that I think is important to note is that some people are worried that there's no temporary suspension available for judges. If there's a complaint, there's a series of new tools that can be used to reprimand a judge. However, suspension is not one of them. It's either permanent removal or they stay in their job, and there's other choices to reprimand a judge, and some people have concerns about that. The other thing I want to mention really quickly is, and that's what I put in the chat, the board, or the committee, I'm sorry, has tabled their final report on the self-intoxication issue. They have issued a few recommendations. They are similar to some of the ones from the House of Commons Committee. And so they support those recommendations that were made. A few that I think that were kind of interesting that sort of stand apart is they suggest, first of all, reviewing data on the use of this provision in the courts, undertaking a review within 3 years, collecting data. They actually suggest essentially redoing the consultation process because a lot of people have concerns, as you know, about the consultation process. And they also suggest, in addition to those reviews, to sending this issue to the Law Commission for study. And I think the most important one that they make actually is a suggestion to include, to consider, a recommendation to consider offenses based on intoxication. So specifically they say, the recommendation reads, the Minister of Justice, without further delay, give due consideration to the possible merits of creating self-induced and other intoxication offenses. So the offense would be on the intoxication, not on the subsequent offense. So I think that those were their major recommendations, and I'll end it there.
Thanks, Brendan. I do have one question on self-intoxication. So the committee is looking at, I presume, then a overhaul of section 33(1) of the code? Is that it?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. They basically want it redone. Yeah, they want consultations to start from the ground up, and they one thing they noted was that there was very little consensus among the witnesses about the ways to proceed. Some people didn't like the idea of using self-intoxication offenses because they felt it watered down the true I don't want to say the underlying offense, but the more egregious offense. But yes, they're basically suggesting a complete overhaul, a review, and sending it to the Law Commission.
Very good, thank you. Any other comments or questions for Brendan? Yeah, Howard, please.
Just on this extreme intoxication thing, it's an unusual process because the bill has already passed and is law. So they can't amend the bill. But the report, Brendan, thanks for the link to that report in the chat. And by the way, I put the link to the 2 reports I mentioned. It's in the chat for this call. So it might be worthwhile to pull those out, Miles, so they can be added to the minutes. But the interesting thing about this, again, the bill is already passed. The bill proposed, I think, a 3-year review by Parliament. And Justice Canada, the minister's reply that I had mentioned earlier, also noted the fact that in 3 years, there will not necessarily be a lot of data. Because the state of extreme intoxication to the point where it obviates the mens rea and the actus rea is a very rare occurrence in the world, in Canada. And so Justice Canada in their response said there will not likely be a lot of data within 3 years, and ongoing monitoring of this is important. But it is interesting in the report, I just was looking at it, Brendan, as you were talking, they're creating an offense of criminal intoxication, or a notion of a criminal intoxication. So it does at least notionally move it on forward a little bit from what the government had in its bill, and the government relied on the notion that it's not what you do after you're so intoxicated, it's that you created the risk by departing from, by exhibiting a marked departure from reasonable conduct by becoming this intoxicated by alcohol, drugs, or both. But it is an interesting thing. So I presume this report goes from the committee to the government for its consideration, but they are proposing a whole sort of little code around 33.1. So certainly worth a look. Anyway, thanks, Brendan. I just wanted to add my sense to that.
Thank you. I would just maybe respond to that really quickly. I agree with you that in 3 years, we might not have a lot of data. The Senate was suggesting that we even look at when the defense was raised, not necessarily when it's successful, which would increase the number of cases that we could review. Also, what's interesting is while the government says that the defense will be so rare, that's kind of their contention. Interestingly, the witnesses, and I understand both sides of this, some witnesses say that it'll never be used because it's so restrictive. Others say it could potentially be quite large because it's actually quite permissive. That's why this report was so difficult. The witnesses didn't agree because people were saying the way it's worded, you could argue that, well, this was my first time taking drug X and Y together. How was I supposed to know that this could reasonably happen? I could not reasonably see it happen. And so people were saying that unless you've taken that specific drug in that exact specific quantity, then you could reasonably raise that defense. So I think that's where the data might be interesting. Perhaps while we think it might be rare, perhaps it'll actually be tried quite a bit because people will raise that defense. We may have more data than we think. And I think that's kind of what's at issue here.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Any other comments or questions? Okay, that brings us to Senate Human Rights. That's me. 3 meetings of import. So April 17th, it was the last meeting that this committee dealt with Islamophobia. It was in camera, so I couldn't access it. I tend to think the last time they went into camera, they generated a report. It's the report that actually led to C-41 and Howard's comments earlier with respect to criminalizing work in Afghanistan that relates to some benefit to the government. So that was a function of this committee's report. 2 meetings on May 1st and 8th. So the committee has turned its attention to, and this is what they refer to as the topic, anti-Black racism, sexism, and systemic discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Commission. All right, I had a chance to look to watch the reports, but to some degree, but I'm remiss to the PRC in that I didn't have the time to take down notes and what have you, which leads me to apologize to the PRC because I tend to be remiss a lot in presenting reports for this particular committee. It just is not something that it's the one thing I can't find or seem to find the time for. So I was hoping that what I would do is put out a note to PRC membership going forward for someone to take over this one committee report for the benefit of the committee. So if people are okay with that, that's what I'd like to do. Oh, Kyle's got his hand up. Or not? Oh, no, he doesn't. Sorry, that was my cursor. Yeah, so I apologize to everybody. I don't have anything more to say. I'm not doing a decent job. I'm not doing a good job at all in reporting on the undertakings of this particular committee. So I'm going to advertise for hopefully somebody to take that up. So again, I apologize. Does anybody have any questions or comments in that regard? Okay. All right. Moving on to business arising. The next item would be sub 5 sub F, and only because Kyle and Matthew are here. So we're still looking at. So Matthew, this has been waiting for your return. A letter to the ministers of justice, public safety regarding the CCGA's history regarding alternatives to incarceration. So we have it on our agenda that both Matthew and Kyle were preparing a draft letter for submission to the ministers. So any comments on that regard? In that regard?
Well, this is a historic position that almost goes back to the origins of the association in 1919. And some of you may not know, but I wrote a history of that association up till I think, well, I guess most recently in the 90s. So I have been seized with teaching activities, and now I'm emeritus. So I better get my act together and see what we can put together with Kyle. This may require a little bit of research in the archives because we've been fairly active over the decades on this question, and it doesn't get much traction right now, as you well know. There's a resurgence of law and order issues now. So it's a difficult time to be talking to a minister about alternatives, et cetera, et cetera. So I will endeavor to do better.
That would be very much appreciated. Anything else? Okay, sub G, this is ongoing. This is dealing with my work in seeking a uniform position with regard to criminal records as grounds for discrimination in the multiple provincial, territorial, and federal human rights arenas. So what I did since our last meeting is I did an overview of the case law, particularly as it related to employment as a grounds for discrimination relative to criminal records. Every case, there was a fair bit of it, but every case to a great degree determined that unless you fell within the exact wording of the grounds for discrimination relating to employment in each jurisdiction, then you didn't have the availability of that particular ground as a human rights protected ground. So I did that. I also looked to see if I could find anything relative to the impact of criminal convictions on housing, and that was pursuant to a comment that Howard made a month or two ago in that context as well. And I didn't find anything because there wasn't anything in the code for each of the individual codes that referenced that as a ground for discrimination relative to criminal convictions. So having said that, the next thing for me to do, I think, would be to prepare the report based upon what I found by way of background information, and I will attend to that expeditiously, or as expeditiously as I can. Any questions or comments about that particular issue? I would say, and this is apropos to what I said earlier about S212, Kim Pate's bill, is that there is a bit of an overlap with respect to whatever impact that bill may have if it ever gets back to the Commons, only because a spent conviction regime will impact people with convictions in all areas, not just employment, but housing and everything. So there will be some kind of interplay if it proceeds the way it appears to be proceeding. All right, guys, moving on to bills under consideration. So you have it in your agenda, very little change in bills. In the Commons bills, the private, there's nothing in the government bills. And in the private Commons bills, C233 is moved to third reading. That, Brendan will tell you, is dealing with, it's dealing with violence against intimate partners. So it's not Brendan's issue, but that's gone to third reading. And there is one new government bill in the Senate, Bill S12. I've given everybody the details of the summary of that bill. It deals with sex offender registration and the International Transfer of Offenders Act. So what it does is that it proposes to change to some degree mandatory registration of sex offenders and put some discretion into the system. So it's there for everybody to see the various points that are in the summary. Any questions or comments on this bill? All right. And private members' bills in the Senate, there are no changes. So that brings us up to date. So does anybody have anything further for the betterment of the committee for today's meeting? Okay, very good. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody's attention and comments.
Hey, Miles.
Oh, Kyle. Okay. Hey, Kyle.
Sorry, can you hear me, Miles?
Yeah, I can see. We can even see you. That's even better.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure it's better, but quickly, item number H in the agenda.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. Yep.
Indigenous and racialized identity data. I have some comments for the group's consideration.
Please.
Bottom line. Bottom line, I would recommend that the PRC, and if it has to go to the chair or to the board, administratively speaking, my advice would be that the CCJA agree in principle with the recommendations for police reported Indigenous and racialized identity data. I think that there's some good guiding principles there. I have no major red flags. With that being said, though, I do think that there are some blind spots that the PRC or the CCJ may wish to consider. Some of those, from my perspective, revolve in and around clearly communicating accountabilities. So by that, I mean like who's actually going to be responsible for monitoring these things, collecting, reporting. I think that the recommendations are also a little bit silent when it comes to a commitment to be publicly reporting these things. So I would recommend that the PRC flag that, and the good bureaucrat in me would also recommend that the recommendations accompany like some key performance metrics. So concretely something that can be reported on publicly showing advancement in this area. And then finally, getting into the weeds a bit, but I am concerned that the recommendations overstate what can and what cannot be done with respect to youth records. So I would encourage the authors of the recommendations to revisit the appropriate provisions in the Youth Criminal Justice Act. I'm happy to provide these in writing for the whole group's consideration, but those are my high-level reflections. Thanks.
Excellent, Kyle. Thank you very much. Yeah, if you would be so kind to put them in writing and report to us so we can review it, approve it, and forward it to the board. That would seem to be appropriate. Anything else?
It sounds, just if I just add, Meg, Kyle,
Sure.
that sounds excellent. Like an excellent assessment with the good and the not so good about, I mean, Stats Canada, we want to encourage to be doing more, and we seem to be seeing some efforts lately, as Brendan and I have noted in the past. But anyway, I like what you're saying there, and love to see something in writing that we could use to send to the government in some form or another. But thank you for that.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, thank you, Howard. Thank you, Kyle. Great. Anything else? Anybody?
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Matthew. Our next meeting is June the 13th, so look forward to seeing everybody then. So thanks, everybody, and take care.